the spinal cord will send another reflex arc back to the muscle. If the muscle thinks it's going to change length very quickly, the muscle spindle is going to give information, and then the muscle, what it's going to do is it's going to clench really tight so that it can resist tearing. That's the whole reason why you don't want to do things like ballistic stretching. Because when you do ballistic stretching and you change the length of the muscle very quickly, the muscle thinks it's going to tear and actually sends a signal to the spinal cord to tighten up. So when you do ballistic kind of stretching, the muscle spindles actually make that kind of stretching counterproductive and make your muscles more stiff. Golgi tendon organs are in your tendons. If your tendons are going to change length very quickly, the tendon thinks it could tear, so it sends a signal to the spinal cord to have your muscle relax. And if your muscle relaxes, it relieves the tension on the tendon. Right, that's the thing when you do the doctor does the knee tap on the patellar tendon. It changes the length of the tendon. No, that would be a muscle spindle. When you change the length of that patellar tendon by banging on your kneecap with the little hammer, the tendon changes length, but that tendon changes the length of the muscle. The muscle thinks it's going to tear and sends a signal back to the spinal cord, which sends a signal back to the muscle and tells the muscle to clench. So your quadricep muscle tightens up and it makes your leg kick out a little bit. But you're just manipulating the afferent signal back to your nervous system. In this case, it's back to your spinal cord, not to your brain. And anyway, those are examples of manipulating the sensory receptors to drive a feedback loop that's going to result in some type of movement. Slide 37, the motor division. It's transmitting information from the brain to the periphery. There are two different divisions, the autonomic and the somatic. Those are all going to be efferent nerves that are going to be sending action potentials to the skeletal muscles to result in either contraction of muscles, or it could also result in contraction of cardiac muscle or also smooth muscles as well. On slide 38, the motor division, autonomic nervous system, it controls involuntary internal functions, like things like involuntary functions are like your heart rate, your breathing rate, your lung function. That's the autonomic, like it's autonomic nervous system controls things that you're not controlling, involuntary movements. The somatic, all right, so we'll go to the next slide, 39. The autonomic nervous system is broken down into the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system is the fight or flight response. When you get into a stressful situation and you feel that immediate rush of blood and that increase in heart rate and blood pressure, it's all the sympathetic nervous system is designed to get blood to your muscles. It's going to restrict the blood vessels in your stomach and in your intestines. It's going to dilate the blood vessels in your muscles. It's going to increase the airway diameter. It's going to increase the amount of energy that you're spending so you have enough energy to be able to get out of a potentially dangerous situation. Your parasympathetic nervous system is going to do the opposite. It's going to try to make sure that you have what you need to rest and save food. It's going to take all of the, to rest and digest. It's going to take your heart rate, blood pressure, and reduce your heart rate and blood pressure. And it's going to take all of the digestion and metabolic processes that are designed to break down calories and get it into your system so that you can store it or utilize it for energy. And it's going to reduce the amount of energy that your body is spending so that you can save that for later. Like after you eat turkey in a Thanksgiving dinner and you feel that I want to go to sleep response, that is your parasympathetic nervous system in action. Table 3.1, slide 41 just talks a little bit about the differences between the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. But one is designed to get your body to move quickly with a lot of oxygen so you can get out of a troubling situation. That's the sympathetic nervous system. It's going to be involved in increase in blood pressure, increase in heart rate, increase in vasodilation of the peripheral nervous system to get blood and oxygen to the muscles, whereas the parasympathetic nervous system is going to result in a reduction in heart rate, a vasodilation of skeletal muscles, vasodilation of the blood vessels in your intestines and in your stomach so that you can digest food and get energy into your body a little bit easier. There are 5 different steps. This is slide 42. There's 5 different steps. The stimulus is going to be sent by the brain. The brain is going to establish an action potential. The action potential is going to be sent through the sensory neurons. The sensory neurons are going to interpret that sensory information. Again, very, very top down. How does the central nervous system interpret? When along the chain of interpretation does the central nervous system finally understand what it is that it's supposed to do? And then, anyway, so then after the central nervous system interprets this information from the sensory nerves, it's going to send an efferent action potential out through the alpha motor neurons, which is going to eventually end up in some type of neuromuscular response. Slide 43, it's a schematic representation of all of this stuff. Figure 3.7 shows that you're going to get an afferent signal. That afferent signal is going to go to the brain, the spinal cord, or the brainstem. The brain, spinal cord, or brainstem is going to figure out what that information means. It's going to send a resultant efferent action potential or signal back down to the muscles, and that muscle is going to have some type of reaction. If it's cold, the muscle is going to start contracting very quickly, so it can release ATP and a shiver and increase body temperature. If the information is something related to pain or heat, then that information will probably go to a spinal level, and the resultant movement will be a quick withdrawal of that limb or a quick contraction of the muscle to promote safety. So depending upon what the signal is, the response can either be a spinal cord or a central nervous system a level of integration, and then the response can be appropriate. All right, slide 45, the sensory motor integration. The sensory input can be integrated in many different areas of the central nervous system. So when an afferent signal comes up to the brain, there are many parts of the brain that could be interacted with. The spinal cord, the lower brainstem, the cerebellum, the thalamus, the cerebral cortex, they're all going to do and be responsible for something potentially different. But it's not to say that the spinal cord and the lower brainstem know what their responsibility is, but they are just happen to be involved in this systemic approach. It seems as though the spinal cord, the lower brainstem, the cerebellum, the thalamus, and the cerebral cortex, it seems like the brain functions on a hierarchy where neither one of those things are more important than the other. But within that hierarchy of the functioning and the complexity of the central nervous system, there's a hierarchy implied there that the central nervous system is still spitting out information to the rest of the body. Figure 3.8 is, you guys can go through that. All right, where are we? So figure 47, slide 47 is saying, like, let's say, for instance, there's a potential for damage to the muscle because the muscle is elongating very quickly. Well, it doesn't make much sense for the muscle spindle information to go through the muscle, up through the spinal cord, all the way into the brain so that the brain can do this integration, and then the brain has to propagate information all the way back down through the brain stem, through the spinal cord, all the way back to the muscle. So some information needs to be integrated much faster than that whole arc can take, even though that whole arc all the way up to the brain and back down to the muscle happens very quickly. There is some information that needs to be processed faster than that. Like if your muscle is going to get injured, right, as opposed to the muscle spindle sending information to the brain, the muscle spindle is going to send information to the spinal cord, and then the spinal cord is going to send what's called an inhibitory or an excitatory response. It's either going to inhibit muscle contraction or it's going to cause muscle contraction. So the muscle can either tighten up and get rigid so it prepares for a potential tear, or it can relax so that it can relieve the tension on the tendon. Those are going to be informations or sensory information that's going to be received from the spinal cord at the spinal level. But there are other sensory information that can innervate in the central nervous system at the motor area of the brain or the lower regions of the brainstem. It just depends on potentially the complexity of the movement and the speed at which the movement needs to occur to potentially provide safety or result in injury to the body. Slide 48, a motor reflex. We'll talk about motor reflexes when we talk. Well, I mean, I think the next couple of slides we start talking about Golgi tendon organs anyway. So, a motor reflex. A reflex is a motor, like a motor signal that does not come from the brain. It's a reflex arc. The information goes right from the muscle, right to the spinal cord, and right back without any cognitive processing of any higher level programming or higher level motor cortex innervation. So, for instance, you have these two fibers. You have muscle spindles. This is slide 49. In your muscle fibers, you have what's called muscle spindles, and in your tendons, you have these Golgi tendon organs. When I do stretching, what stretching is, especially neuromuscular, proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation, PNF, proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation. Proprioceptors are these receptors that are in your cells, that are in your muscles, that they receive information. Proprioceptors, they receive information about where your body is in space. The two major proprioceptors that we're going to talk about that I've said before are Golgi tendon organs and muscle spindles. When you do something like proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation, you're facilitating the proprioceptors at giving information through the neural system, through the neurons to the muscle, and you're trying to use that information to relax the muscle to help people stretch better. So the way that muscle spindles work is when the muscle spindles are activated, it's because the muscle is changing length rapidly. If the muscle is changing length rapidly, the muscle could potentially tear. So the muscle spindles are alerted. They send a reflex or a signal back to the spinal cord, and the spinal cord sends a reflex arc that that excites the muscle contraction. So the muscle is elongating, it thinks it's going to tear, so the response is the muscle contracts to try to hold itself together. That's what muscle spindles do. All right, that's it. When stretched, muscle spindles send sensory information. The information synapses in the spinal cord with an alpha motor neuron, and that alpha motor neuron is going to trigger a reflex muscle contraction, not a cognitively driven muscle contraction, but a reflex arc. Happens much faster than that cognitively driven muscle contraction, preventing damage and also making sure that the muscle doesn't elongate unnecessarily. That's called the stretch reflex, and you experience that when somebody bangs your patella tendon with a little hammer at the doctor's office and your leg twitches. You also have Golgi tendon organs. Golgi tendon organs are embedded in the tendon. It's like a little miniature strain gauge. This is another example right here. The Golgi tendon organ is a strain gauge. A strain gauge is an engineered tool that humans invented. It's a mechanical tool that they use to determine the stress or the tension on any particular material. But the strain gauge is an engineered a tool designed and developed by the human brain. So the Golgi tendon organ was around much longer than a strain gauge. So the strain gauge is more like a Golgi tendon organ. You can't use the term strain gauge to explain Golgi tendon organ because a Golgi tendon organ was invented prior to a strain gauge. It's another example here of a mechanistic view of the body where each part of the body has a mechanical equivalent. Right here, the Golgi tendon organs are strain gauges. In any event, when a tendon is elongating, all right, that tendon thinks it could potentially tear, and there's tension that's stored in the tendon. So to relieve that tension, the Golgi tendon organ sends yet another signal to the spinal cord that sends a reflex back to the muscle, and it tells the muscle to relax. And if the muscle relaxes, it relieves all the tension in the Golgi tendon or in the tendon. Sometimes when I want to try to stretch my athletes, what I'll do, especially if I'm trying to stretch the pecs, I'll find where the pectoralis major tendons are, and I'll push down very slowly for about 30 seconds creating tension in the pectoralis major tendons. When I create tension, what I'm doing is sending a reflex signal to the pectoralis major muscles to relax. So I'll push on the tendons for 30 seconds, and then I'll open up the chest and stretch their pectoralis majors and minors. Then I'll find the tendons and push for 30 seconds, and then I'll open up and stretch for 30 seconds. I am stretching using a combination of physical movement of the body, but I'm manipulating the neuromuscular signal, creating a relaxed state in the muscle by manipulating the proprioceptors, specifically muscle spindles and Golgi tendon organs. I'm sure you guys have heard of proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation before, and that is a way of not just mechanically stretching the length of the muscles, but you're using very carefully the neuromuscular information given by the afferent proprioceptives, muscle spindles, and Golgi tendon organs to kind of engineer flexibility, to engineer a relaxation of the muscle. And it's oftentimes a neuromuscular efficiency that may lead to an increase in flexibility as opposed to just the mechanical tearing apart of the sarcomeres and elongating the muscle. So research out there is suggesting right now that potentially flexibility is a result of eccentric muscle contraction. It could be also a result of actual just when you're doing yoga and when you're doing flexibility, oftentimes you don't have to worry about the other stresses in your life. So it could be that the actual act of this meditative stretching results in a reduction in overall body stress. And because there's a reduction in overall body stress, the muscle relaxes and there's more stretchable. But it could also be that we're manipulating the neuromuscular pathway, the neuromuscular signals between the muscles and the central nervous system or the peripheral nervous system to result in muscle relaxation, and we're actually manipulating the neural signals to result in flexibility. There's figure 3.9 has a schematic representation of both of those, and I think that the last slide, 52, is reiterating that it's the alpha motor neuron that carries the action potential to the muscle. It's not the alpha motor. It's not an action potential that travels up through the brain and is a brain top-down driven movement. So in regards to this hierarchical motor programming and motor control, it's not the brain actually that controls all movements. Here's an example right here of movement that is actually not controlled by the brain. So anyway, that's chapter 3. I hope you guys have a good day. Love you so much. Peace.